The cold winds howled through Winterfell the night Ned Stark was taken to King's Landing. But in this version of the world, he did one thing differently. He left Jon Snow behind with Robb, not sent to the wall, not handed off to the Night's Watch. Just one choice, one delay, and everything changed. When news of Ned's capture reached the north, the castle didn't erupt into the same quiet panic. This time, Jon was there, not just as Robb's half-brother, but as his shadow, his sword, his conscience. Robb may have been the king in the north, but Jon was the wolf at his side, steady and sharp. They had always fought together, trained together. Robb was the noble-born heir, but Jon had always been the better fighter. More importantly, Jon had always watched people more closely, listened, thought, doubted, where Robb sometimes rushed with pride. And now, with war on the wind, Jon's voice mattered more than ever. Robb called his banners. The lords of the north answered. The Umbers, the Karstarks, the Glovers all marched. But now they marched with the bastard of Winterfell riding beside their king, a Stark in all but name. Some of them didn't like it, some whispered, but they saw how Jon fought, how he bled, how he bared his teeth at the Lannisters and didn't flinch. Catelyn Stark still didn't trust him. She never had. Her eyes hardened every time she looked at Jon, as if Ned's mistake was alive in front of her. But she kept her mouth shut. More often now, because even she couldn't deny what he meant to Robb. When they rode south, Jon wasn't just another sword. He was Robb's envoy to the uneasy houses. He was the one who spoke to the Mormonts when they hesitated, who stood, calm and sharp, before Lord Frey's demanding eyes. And when it came to battle, he was brutal, fast, merciless. The first clash with the Lannisters near the Whispering Wood ended in a Stark victory. Robb's plan was clever, but Jon's scouting had made it possible. His small band of riders found the weakest path into the enemy's flank. He didn't take credit. He never did, but the men knew. They saw, and when Jaime Lannister was captured, it was Jon who stopped the Northerners from killing him on the spot. "He's worth more breathing than bleeding," he said, standing in front of the Kingslayer with his sword drawn. Even then, his voice carried more weight than his name ever had. But not everything went right. After the battle, they camped in the south, and tensions brewed like a storm. The Karstarks wanted revenge for their dead sons. Robb tried to hold them together with honor. Jon spoke with fire instead. "We lose each other, we lose the war," he told the northern lords in a cold tent, voice low and sharp. "You think the Lannisters will kneel if we start eating each other alive?" It wasn't a king's speech. It wasn't noble, but it worked. For now, Catelyn still feared what Jon could become. She saw the men following him with eyes too full of loyalty. Saw Robb lean on him more and more. In her mind, Jon was still a threat, not to her husband anymore, but to her son's throne. Robb didn't see it that way. To him, Jon was the only one who never lied, never flattered, never hesitated. The one person who would tell him when he was being a fool. So, when Robb was crowned king in the north, he didn't look at the lords first. He looked at Jon, and Jon, still dressed in plain black, stepped forward and knelt. "You have my sword," he said. "You have my life." Robb raised him up. "You have my trust," he said back, voice tight with emotion, "and my brotherhood." But the war wasn't over, and not every wolf survives the winter. The South was no friend to Northern steel. The deeper Robb's army pushed into enemy territory, the more wolves found themselves lost in strange woods and colder beds. The rivulet had been burned and bloodied by Tywin Lannister's forces. Villages lay blackened. Children cried for parents long dead. The war was not just fought on battlefields, it festered in the soil and in the hearts of men. Robb struggled. Every day he wore the crown heavier. But John became colder, sharper. He had no titles, no lands, no inheritance to his name. Only war, only the sword on his back and the enemies ahead. That made him dangerous, useful, feared. Jon began leading more raids himself. Quick strikes, night ambushes. He knew the value of fear, and he turned it into a weapon. The name Snow started to mean something south of the neck. Captured soldiers spoke of the ghost. With the dark eyes and the silent blade, they said. He never hesitated, never smiled. Some lords whispered Robb was losing control of his half-brother, that Jon Snow was becoming something darker, something that didn't kneel easily. But Robb trusted him still, trusted him too much. Catelyn came to Robb one night in his war tent. Her eyes were lined with weariness, and grief still weighed her like iron. "He's not your blood," she said coldly. "Don't forget that." Robb didn't even look up from his map. "He's more my brother than Theon ever was." Her mouth tightened. And what happens when the men start whispering that Snow would make a better king than a boy playing with honor? Robb slammed his hand on the table. "Jon doesn't want a crown." "No," she said, "but others may want it for him." Still, Robb did not listen. Meanwhile, Jon was sent to parley with Roose Bolton, who'd been slow to commit his full strength. The Dreadfort men were known for cruelty and cold eyes. Jon didn't flinch when he entered Bolton's hall. "You're not your father's heir," Roose said flatly over wine. "Why risk your life for a throne that isn't yours?" Jon stared back. "Because the man on that throne is my brother, and I'd rather die beside him than live under a lion's rule." Bolton's eyes flickered with interest. "Loyalty like that gets men killed." "Then I'll die loyal," Jon said. But Roose Bolton was already weighing other things. He watched Jon walk out with quiet calculation, as if measuring where a blade might slip easiest between ribs. Then came the betrayal that changed everything. News reached them at camp that Theon had taken Winterfell, burned it, killed Bran and Rickon. Or so it seemed. Robb staggered. Grief hit him like a club. But Jon snapped. He stood up in front of the entire war council. "I'll kill him," he said, voice low and final. "With my bare hands." Robb began, but Jon was already turning away. It was Catelyn who stopped him. "You leave now, and you abandon your king. He's my family. So is Robb," she hissed. Jon looked between them. He said nothing for a long time. In the end, it was Robb who made the decision. He placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "We ride together." And just like that, the war took a pause. 100 riders peeled away from the main army, racing north through mud and blood toward the ruins of home. Robb with his banners, Jon with his rage. No longer just a campaign for vengeance or thrones. Now it was personal. The North remembered, and it would bleed for every inch Theon Greyjoy had taken. They rode through rain and snow, pushing their horses to the edge of death. The riverlands fell behind them, and the stench of smoke grew stronger with every mile north. Winterfell, the heart of the North, was not just a castle, it was their childhood, their blood, and now it lay in ashes. The closer they came, the more men joined them. Small folk, broken bannermen, house guards who had fled the sack of Winterfell. Word spread like wildfire. Robb Stark was returning, and Jon Snow rode with him and they were bringing the storm. When they reached the outer woods near Winterfell, the trees were black with soot. Jon scouted ahead, alone, as he often did. He moved through the dark like a shadow until he saw the broken towers, the burnt walls, the flayed corpses nailed to the gates. What Theon had done wasn't just treason, it was madness. Jon returned to camp silent, teeth clenched. He burned. Them, he finally said to Robb. Our brothers. Robb looked away, jaw trembling. Then we bury him alive. They attacked at dawn. The Ironborn had grown lazy, believing Robb was too deep in the south to return. They drank themselves blind in the great hall while the castle's bones still smouldered. The gates cracked open like a skull under Jon's hammer. By the time the sun rose, half the Ironborn were dead, and the others were begging for the sea. Jon didn't stop. He moved through the halls like a blade, searching, cutting, until he found Theon himself cornered, shaking, with blood on his hands and regret in his eyes. I had no choice, Theon whispered, dropping his sword. Jon stared at him, chest heaving. You had every choice. He wanted to end it, right there, blade in hand. But Robb stepped between them. No, Robb said. He faces justice. He is justice, Jon snarled. But Robb held his brother back, not because he doubted his rage, but because Robb still believed in law, in honor, even now. They locked Theon away, not knowing that a darker fate awaited him later under Ramses. Knife, the bodies of Bran and Rickon were found burned beyond recognition, buried under scorched stone. No one questioned it aloud, but a silence gripped the camp, something deeper than mourning, something cold and heavy. Jon sat by the fire that night, eyes hollow, ghost at his feet, his sword across his lap. They were just boys, he said. We were supposed to protect them. Robb didn't answer. He couldn't. For the first time, the king in the north looked like a child himself. The northern lords urged them to stay and rebuild, but Robb refused. We can mourn later. He told them, the war isn't over. We still have a mother to free, a father to avenge. Jon said nothing. But when they rode south again, Winterfell behind them in ruins, he didn't look back. Back in the south, things had changed. Tywin Lannister was no longer just defending. He was hunting, using brutal tactics, false bannermen, and alliances dipped in gold. And with Robb gone from the main army, Roose Bolton had started whispering in darker corners. He had accepted the role of acting commander, but he moved coldly, always out of reach, always with too few guards and too many secrets. Jon didn't trust him. He smiles with his mouth, not his eyes, he warned Robb. I don't like the way he stares at our backs. Robb frowned. We need him. He's won us battles. We don't need a dagger in the dark. But Robb, still young, still tied to honor, shook his head. I'll not start cutting down allies because of shadows and hunches. So Jon kept watching. He began visiting Bolton's men at night, speaking to scouts, bribing low-born soldiers with wine. And slowly, pieces began to fall into place. Bolton wasn't just waiting for a battle. He was waiting for a betrayal. The signs were subtle at first. Bolton's riders returning with too few wounds, their stories to clean. Messages sent under false names. Certain northern scouts found dead with no enemy in sight. Jon didn't have proof, not yet, but he could feel it in his bones. Roose Bolton was playing a long game, and Robb was the final piece. Back at the war, Camp Robb was distracted. Word had come that his mother, Catelyn, had released Jaime Lannister in secret, hoping to exchange him for Sansa and Arya. It shattered the trust between her and Robb. The Northern Lords were furious. Jon was furious too. He murdered our father. Jon growled when he found Catelyn outside her tent. And you let him go for hope. He's the only chance we had, she said, voice trembling. You wouldn't understand. You have no daughters. Jon stepped closer. No, I only have brothers. And now I've buried 2 of them. They stared at each other in the dark. The silence, a chasm neither could cross. Whatever fragile thread had existed between them snapped in that moment, never to be tied again. Meanwhile, Robb tried to hold the army together, but something had changed. The Karstarks abandoned him. Lords began speaking of Robb's new southern bride, to Lysahand, the insult it brought. They had expected him to marry a Frey, and Walder Frey wasn't a man to forgive insults. Jon met with Robb the night before they planned to send emissaries to appease the Freys. He sat across from his brother, watching the flicker of doubt in his eyes. You've made enemies with every step south, Jon said quietly. I'm fighting a war, Robb replied. You're fighting a storm with your sword and expecting loyalty from snakes. Robb stood up, pacing. I trusted you to be my strength, not my shadow. Jon's eyes narrowed. And I've done just that. But you trust too easily, Robb. Your honor will get you killed. Robb looked away. I'd rather die with honor than live with betrayal. Jon stood. Then, make peace with death. Despite the tension, they remained united in public. They rode into the Twins together, cloaked in banners and false hope, seeking to mend the insult with House Frey. But Jon stayed outside the great hall. He didn't trust the food, didn't trust the smiles. Something in the air smelled wrong. Ghost paced beside him, ears flat, growling low. Then the music changed. Jon turned to the hall just as the doors slammed shut. Screams, steel, blood. He sprinted, fought through the outer guards, blade flashing. Men in Frey armor tried to stop him. He gutted them one by one. But by the time he reached the hall's entrance, it was too late. He saw Catelyn first, throat cut open like a sacrificial lamb. Then Robb, on his knees, pale, bleeding. A dozen spears pointed at him. Jon tried to rush in, but arrows whistled past him. One caught his shoulder, another pierced his thigh. And then Walder Frey stepped forward, smug and cruel. Kill the bastard too, he sneered. But Roose Bolton held up a hand. No, he said. Let him crawl back to the north. Let the wolves see what happens when they send bastards to fight. Lions. Bolton stepped over Robb's body, whispering something no one else could hear. Then he drove a dagger into the king's heart. Jon's scream broke the sky. He fought back barely, wounded, bleeding, half mad. Ghost tore through flesh as Jon swung blindly, trying to cut a path through betrayal and fire. Somehow, barely, he escaped. He rode for hours with blood soaking his tunic, arrows still lodged in his side, until he collapsed in the forest under a dying moon. The war was over. The king in the north was dead, but the bastard of Winterfell was still alive, and the north would pay for what it allowed to happen. The pain hit Jon in waves, not just from the wounds in his flesh, but the ones carved deeper in his heart, in his soul. Robb was dead. The Freys had butchered him like a dog, and Roose Bolton had watched it happen, had delivered the final blow. Jon had failed. He lay beneath a canopy of dead branches, barely breathing, his sword soaked with the blood of Frey guards. Ghost pressed against his side, keeping watch, his white fur streaked with crimson. Days passed in a haze. Fever took him. He dreamt of fire, of wolves howling in the dark, of Robb screaming his name before the light died in his eyes. When Jon finally woke, it was to the soft crunch of snow. Someone had found him. 2 riders stood over him, spears in hand, faces shadowed beneath thick hoods. Northmen from House Reed, perhaps, or a survivor from one of the fallen houses. "Is it him?" one asked the other. The second man knelt beside Jon, brushing the blood from his cheek. "Aye, it's Snow, the king's shadow." They carried him north in silence. Jon recovered slowly at a hidden camp near the neck, where remnants of Stark loyal forces had gathered men who had refused to bow to the Boltons or the Freys. When they heard what happened at the Twins, many wept. Others demanded war, but most just looked to Jon. He wasn't their king. He wasn't even their lord, but he was alive, and he was angry. Jon stood before the fire one night, the wind howling around him, and said it plainly. "We march on the Dreadfort," some argued. Some begged him to wait to rebuild strength, to seek help from the Vale or the Night's Watch. But Jon had no patience left for caution. "They murdered my brother," he said, "and now they wear wolfskins while they lick Tywin's boots. I'll not let that stand." He left that night with 100 men, most of them broken, some of them half-starved, but all of them loyal. Jon didn't fight like a king. He fought like vengeance. They began with small attacks, Bolton scouts, supply wagons, isolated keeps. Each victory fed their legend. The Ghost Wolf, they started calling him. The Bastard of the North. Rumors spread like frost that he couldn't be killed, that he was half direwolf, that he bathed in Frey blood. Jon didn't care. Let them believe what they wanted. The Dreadfort was not like other castles, cold, fortified, full of men who had betrayed the Starks and now served Ramsay Bolton, Roos's bastard. A bastard versus a bastard. When Jon reached the gates of the Dreadfort, he didn't ask for parley, he ordered fire. It wasn't a battle, it was a purge. They scaled the walls at night. Jon led the charge. He didn't speak, didn't give speeches. He just cut his way through Ramsay's men with a fury that turned even his allies pale. Inside the halls, he found Ramsay grinning. "You've got the wrong bastard," Ramsay said, smirking, 2 knives in hand. "Should have died with your precious king." Jon didn't answer. They fought like animals, fast, brutal, dirty. Ramsay was clever, vicious, but Jon was colder, sharper, focused like a blade. In the end, Jon didn't kill Ramsay with a sword. He let Ghost do it, and no one watching shed a tear. The North erupted. News of Ramsay's death travelled like wildfire. Roose Bolton, now Warden of the North in name only, found himself besieged by angry bannermen and rebellious houses. Fear spread faster than loyalty ever had. And at the centre of it all stood Jon Snow. Not a king, not a Stark, just a ghost of war, walking through the ashes of everything he'd lost. But people started saying it anyway. He's the North now. Jon didn't ask to be a leader. He didn't sit on a throne or wear a crown. But the North needed someone to believe in again. And with Robb dead, the Stark name bleeding into myth, Jon became that symbol, not because he wanted it, but because there was no one else left. The surviving northern houses gathered one by one. The Mormonts came first, their Lady Lyanna, fierce and unbending. The Glovers followed, then the Reeds, the Hornwoods, even stragglers from the shattered Karstarks, who had turned their backs on Robb. They saw Jon not just as vengeance reborn, but as the last thread connecting them to honor. Roose Bolton, still holding Winterfell, responded by sending ravens soaked in veiled threats. He claimed Jon was nothing but a bastard pretending to be a king, a traitor to the realm, a threat to the peace Tywin Lannister had brokered. But even Tywin couldn't send his armies this far north, while the south was still recovering from rebellion and fractured alliances. Jon replied with a raven of his own. No titles, no pleasantries. Winterfell is mine. Come take it, if you dare. Roose did not march. He built walls higher. He sent spies. He turned to darker tools. Jon began his siege slowly. Starvation, interception, freeing small keeps under Bolton control, reuniting the bannermen inch by inch. He didn't fight fair. He didn't give mercy to those who had worn the flayed man. The people followed him not out of blind loyalty, but because he made them believe they could win again. But the toll was growing. Jon rarely slept. The dreams returned every time he closed his eyes. Robb, bleeding in the rain, Catelyn screaming, Winterfell burning. He didn't speak of it. He buried it under steel and strategy. Lady Mormont came to him one cold evening. "You don't look like a hero," she said, handing him a mug of boiled wine. "But heroes die. You're still breathing." Jon gave her a tired look. "Heroes don't burn castles. They do when the wrong men sit in them." She didn't smile when she said it. Neither did he. Then something shifted. A secret raven arrived from Maester Walkenstill inside Winterfell, still serving the Boltons under fear. It told Jon what he needed most. Roose was losing control. His southern allies were no longer sending gold or men. Supplies were low. Ramsay was dead, and without his cruelty, fear had begun to crack. It was time. Jon gave the order. "We take Winterfell at dawn." They came from 3 sides. Snow blinded the guards. Fires lit up the sky like a second sun. Jon didn't wait behind the lines. He was the first over the wall, sword in hand, teeth gritted against pain and memory. The north rose behind him like a tidal wave. Inside, Roose Bolton stood in the great hall, dressed in fine black, wine in hand, as if he'd already accepted his fate. "You fight well for a name that was never yours," Roose said as Jon approached him, blood still dripping from Longclaw. Jon didn't answer. Roose sneered. "You think they'll follow you when the snow melts? You're a weapon, not a ruler." Jon stepped closer. "And you're a relic." Roose reached for his dagger. Jon cut him down before he could breathe. It was done. Winterfell was reclaimed. The flayed man banners were ripped from the towers and burned in the godswood. Snow blanketed everything white, clean, almost peaceful. The next morning, Jon stood where Ned Stark once stood, at the head of the great hall. The northern lords gathered below, their eyes tired but shining. It was Lyanna Mormont who spoke first. "He may be a bastard," she said, voice echoing, "but he's the blood of the North. He fought for us when no one else would. He avenged the king in the North. And I don't care what name he was born with. He is Jon Stark." The hall roared. Jon tried to refuse. He said he wasn't a king, that the wars weren't over, that the wall still stood, and the darkness beyond it stirred. But the North had already made up its mind, and this time the crown came not with gold, but with blood, frost, and fire. Jon didn't wear the crown. He had one forged simple, unadorned, shaped from northern Steeland, placed it on the mantle above Ned Stark's old chair in the great hall. "I'll lead," he said to the gathered lords, "but I am not your king. I'm your shield. I'll fight for the North, not rule over it." And still, They called him the White Wolf, king in the north. Whether he accepted it or not, the title clung to him like frostbite. Winterfell began to breathe again. The fires burned warm in the hearths. Children returned. The godswood, once drowned in snow and shadow, was tended again. The scars remained, but the heart of the north was no longer under a flayed banner. But Jon had no peace. He sat alone, often, writing letters, one to the wall, warning of what stirred in the far north, one to the Vale, cautious and brief, one even to Daenerys Stormborn, though he doubted it would ever reach her. Ghost never left his side, neither did his sword. He walked the halls like a man half-formed, eyes always pulled beyond the snow-covered walls towards something darker. Then came the Raven, from Castle Black. The Night's Watch had seen movement. The White Walkers were stirring. Villages beyond the wall were silent, and the wildlings had vanished like smoke. Jon read the letter twice. Then he went to the crypts beneath Winter. He stood before Ned Stark's statue, snowflakes falling even underground. "I never got to say goodbye," he whispered. "I should have gone to the wall like you wanted. Maybe then Robb would still be alive. Maybe then ... But statues don't speak, they only watch." Jon left Winterfell that night without ceremony. He didn't tell the lords. He left a letter in the great hall, sealed with the Stark direwolf. "If the wall falls, the north won't matter. I go where the war truly lies." He took only Ghost and a handful of trusted men veterans who had bled beside him, who didn't ask questions. They rode through wind and death toward the wall, through abandoned farms and white forests where the trees whispered. At Castle Black, the brothers of the Night's Watch stood thinner than ever, no Targaryen queen. No Lord Commander worth the title. Just boys and old men holding a gate against a storm they barely believed in. But when Jon arrived, everything changed. They stood straighter. They spoke his name in whispers. The bastard who burned the Dreadfort, the Stark who fights like a ghost. He didn't want their awe. He only asked one thing: open the gate. The wall loomed, a pale giant of ice and time. Beyond it, the darkness stirred. Jon stood atop the watchtower as the wind screamed. Snow lashed his cloak. Ghost growled low at his side. He saw them, a sea of white, dead men walking, eyes like frozen stars. He didn't flinch. He only whispered, "It's not over, Robb. I'll finish what we couldn't." Then he turned to his men, drew his sword, and stepped beyond the wall. The land beyond the wall was quiet to quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of snow crunching under boots and the soft panting of Ghost beside him. Jon led his men through a white wasteland that had once been home to wildlings, giants and children of the forest. Now it felt like a graveyard waiting to be filled. They found the first village by dusk. The fires still burned in the hearths, untouched. Food on the tables, beds unmade, but not a soul in sight. They didn't run, one of Jon's men whispered. They were taken. No one argued. Jon didn't sleep that night. He sat with Ghost by the dying flames, watching shadows move just beyond the light. He could feel that death was close, and it wasn't wearing a Lannister's colors this time. They pressed on the next morning, deeper into the true north, guided by old maps and half-remembered paths from Tormund's stories. But nothing prepared them for what lay ahead. They found a massacre. Dozens of wildlings men, women, children. Where they stood, their eyes wide, mouths still screaming. Their flesh pale as chalk, limbs twisted, faces locked in terror. Jon approached slowly. Longclaw was heavy in his hand. Then one of them moved. A child, no more than 6. Her skin blue, her eyes brighter than any sky. She turned her head toward Jon and screamed. The others began to rise. Jon didn't hesitate. "Burn them," he shouted. Torches lit. Fire roared. The dead fell screaming. Longclaw danced through cold flesh, black blood steaming in the snow. It was not a battle, it was survival. The dead did not fear, did not tire. But Jon had rage, and Ghost had teeth, and the living had fire. When it was over, half his men were gone, burned, torn, frozen. But the path forward was clear. The White Walkers were not just coming, they were here. Jon pushed forward with the few who remained. Each mile felt heavier, the cold deeper. He dreamt strange dreams, of blue-eyed kings, of thrones made of bone, of voices whispering in the old tongue. And always he saw Robb, bleeding, smiling, waiting. Then, at last, they reached the old ruins at the Fist of the First Men. There, atop that ancient hill, Jon found what he feared, an army, 10,000 dead, maybe more, standing silent in the snow. At their center, mounted on a pale horse, was the Night King. He saw Jon and raised one hand. Jon raised Longclaw in answer. He knew he couldn't win. Not here, not alone, but he could send a message. He turned to his last surviving rider. "Go south. Tell them what's coming. Tell them I saw the Night King with my own eyes. And you?" the man asked, trembling. Jon looked back toward the dead. "I'm going to buy you time." And then he charged. Ghost howled beside him. Steel met frost, fire met death, and the snow turned red one final time. Epilogue: the rider returned to Winterfell days later, half dead with frostbite and fear. He carried no body, no blade, only words. Jon Snow stood alone at the Fist. He didn't run, he didn't kneel, he faced them all. And from that day on, the North remembered not just Robb, the boy who was king, but Jon the bastard who became a legend. The White Wolf, the last Stark to ride into the storm and never return.